50 years, I think Peace Corps volunteers have served in just about every country in Africa. So that was one part of the Kennedy view as he came in, was this sort of idealistic view of let's help these young countries that we don't know. Nobody knew Africa at that time, much less so than even today, and see how that goes. So the first group of volunteers went off to Ghana. For some reason, Ghana was always has often been a special place for Americans. The first place that volunteers have gone to, and also it's the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that President Obama so far has visited during his presidency. Other presidents, Bill Clinton, George Bush, have also visited Ghana. The second country was Cameroon, where I served as ambassador, and there they've had an unbroken presence for that entire time. So now 50 years of volunteers serving in different parts of Cameroon. The second aspect, though, was the Cold War backdrop to our engagement with just about everybody in the world at that time. These nations were coming of age, and there was this intense ideological contest going on between the United States and American allies in the Soviet Union, and that played out in very odd and sometimes destructive ways across the African continent for I'd say the first 30 years of the independence of most of these countries. And for example, when I went to, and it was pretty intense. I mean, there were a lot of, most of these countries knew nothing of democracy. Most of them were ruled by dictators, often very brutal ones. And the question was, to paraphrase Richard Nixon, is he their bastard or is he our bastard? And I think in one of his famous quotes he said, well, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. And I know when I went off to Kinshasa and did my training in Eastern Zaire in 1977, it was pretty close to the height of the Cold War. And Mobutu was the president of Zaire. I was 22 years old and very skeptical about the whole enterprise. And I remember when the U.S. ambassador, whom I later met in a different setting, came down and gave us kind of a swearing in. He swore us in as Peace Corps volunteers. We all took the same oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution that anybody takes who serves the United States, and gave a speech about what the United States was doing in Zaire. I don't remember the exact words, but I remember being not very impressed and thinking, questioning very strongly what my country was doing in a place like that with such a autocratic ruler, so little commitment to the people of the country, or at least their well-being. I mean, because it was quite obvious that very little of the wealth of that country was trickling down to the people that I could see. But that's a fact, and I think it's something that has come up over and over in terms of analyzing the history of the United States through that period. So those were the two aspects of Kennedy. It was the juxtaposition of this idealism about helping young countries who, after all, were coming through at least a post-colonial experience, if not a revolutionary one, to get their independence, which was something that America could relate to. And then this competition with the Soviet Union, which I saw in many different ways during the different times that I served in Africa. I think the presidency of Johnson and then Nixon was so wrapped up with Vietnam and then domestic politics, Watergate, that there isn't a very long or deep record of certainly presidential level engagement with Africa during their presidencies. To be sure, there were crises that required attention. I certainly remember very well Nigeria in around 1970, 71 when Biafra spun off and declared its independence, and there was a brutal war to prevent Biafra from becoming an independent nation. It was divisive in the United States because this was one of the first, I would say certainly in my lifetime, one of the first international humanitarian crises, tragedies that was visible on television. There were lots of terrible images of very malnourished young children, Biafran children, and so there was a strong sense of American sympathy on a popular level for, what is it that these people want? This could be a subject for somebody's dissertation, but in a couple of words, there was a tribal aspect to it. The people of Biafra belonged to one major ethnic group, and so that was part of a centrifugal tendency that is something that remains a force in Africa to this day, and unfortunately into the future. There's also an economic aspect. Most of the oil in Nigeria is found in the part of Nigeria that Biafra covered. So the notion of sort of declaring independence and taking oil with them was appealing and strongly opposed by the central government in Lagos. But the position of most of the outside world was then, as it has remained in most cases, one of however flawed the colonial borders were for African countries, however much they may have cut ethnic groups in half and made no sense, was that the territorial integrity of African nations should be respected. And so that was the position of the United States in the early 70s with respect to the Biafran secession movement. If you fast forward to Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, I would say at that point the big issues in Africa were on the southern end now. One was Rhodesia and the unilateral Declaration of Independence that had come in 1965 and had led to this very racially divided country with only 200,000 white people in it who were in charge, and our insistence that the United States insistence that the resolutions of the United Nations with respect to respecting majority rule and what would become Zimbabwe be respected. And the other part was a simmering and fast heating up issue about apartheid in South Africa. And Jimmy Carter, as you might remember, one of the hallmarks of his presidency was an unprecedented focus on human rights. And the naming of Andrew Young as a civil rights activist from Atlanta, Georgia, later the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, as the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And Andrew Young, for various reasons, took a particular interest in what was happening in southern Africa, and actually became one of the major negotiators for the agreements that eventually led to the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980 and the accession to power of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. In the presidency of Ronald Reagan, again, probably the biggest issue in our relations with Africa remained South Africa. And his policy was to shift away from what he regarded, I think, as an unrealistic and perhaps a bit sanctimonious emphasis on human rights as the basis for foreign policy in Africa to one of a more tolerant, constructive, what he called constructive engagement with the apartheid regime in South Africa. This was highly controversial throughout his presidency, and he ended up encountering strong congressional opposition, and actually resolutions were passed in Congress that led to the embargo and sanctions against South Africa that he actually opposed. That's probably the best example I can think of a case where sanctions, in my view, actually made a strong positive difference. Sanctions are, in my view, in my experience, limited value in terms of achieving results. They're often of great value in sending a message. But in the case of South Africa, that was a critical part of the policy. I should mention one other aspect that goes back to the 70s. The countries that didn't receive their independence or didn't win their independence in the early 60s were mainly the Portuguese colonies, primarily Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, and then the Cape Verde Islands and Sao Tome and Principe. They all got their independence in 1970 when there was 75 when there was a collapse. Of the central Portuguese government and change of government in Portugal. It became a democracy at that time, and they let their colonies go sort of without any preparation. And what that generated, particularly in Angola and Mozambique, were vicious civil wars that lasted for over 15 years. And I mention that because in those civil wars, the United States picked sides, and on the other side were basically Cuba and the Soviet Union. The Cubans in particular sent tens of thousands of troops into Angola, who were still there when I served in the 1980s in the Congo, and because it was a People's Republic and somewhat aligned with Angola, as an American diplomat, I would often see Cuban diplomats going through the Congo at that time. But that's another important milestone just to keep in mind, because to this day, I mean, I have friends that have served as diplomats in Angola, and we're trying to have an improved relationship with this very large, very influential country that Angola has become, and try to overcome the fact that we backed the wrong side, or the side that did not prevail, so that the MPLA, which was backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, is the faction in Angola that eventually took power when the Civil War ended, well, during the Civil War, and then certainly when it ended. So sometimes these decisions that we make as a matter of policy do come back to haunt us, but they're simply facts of life and have to be dealt with. The George Bush presidency from 89 to 93. Obviously, it was very much a presidency that was focused on the demise of the Soviet Union. I'm sure you've studied that in other courses. And the important thing is that while all that was going on in Eastern Europe, and the Berlin Wall fell and with all its consequences, there was what was called in Africa at the time the wind from the east, which blew down from Central Europe across much of Africa, and that was really the beginning of the overt manifestation in Africa and the achievement of, in Africa, democratic regimes in a number of countries. One of the ones that I served in, Cameroon, was a country in which the winds of democracy failed to achieve an overthrow of the government. When I was there, and some 10 years later, it was still very much on the minds of the people of Cameroon that in 1992, I believe it was, that the president, who remains in power today, was widely perceived to have stolen the election from somebody else who probably won it. But in countries like Benin and certainly Ghana, which in many ways has become kind of a model of African democracy and of African leaders willing to step down and accept the results of elections that they did not win. That was a very important time for that development. The George Bush presidency, George Bush Senior presidency, was also the time of our intervention in Somalia, when I think the basic facts in 1990-1991 were an enormous drought in the country, and the beginnings of this warlord system, which has actually run the country for the last 2 decades. Inability to bring in food assistance, inability to distribute it to the people who need it most. So the president decided at the very end of his presidency to send in American troops to help with the distribution of humanitarian assistance. I was actually serving in France at that time, and the only time that I actually met George Bush was after he lost the election to Bill Clinton, and he was going to Somalia at Thanksgiving in 1991 to have Thanksgiving with the troops that were there. It wasn't but, I'm sorry, I said 1991. It would have been late 1992. And then it wasn't but 1 year later that we had this terrible incident in the streets of Mogadishu where American troops were killed and captured and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, which created kind of a great unwillingness on the part of the United States to become involved in what were seen as internal African crises. And so a year later, in 1994, when the Rwandan genocide broke out, there was this very strong overhang of the experience in the streets of Mogadishu that were probably more influential than anything else in convincing Bill Clinton that he should hang back and not intervene in Rwanda, even though the advice from many was that if we did, we could make a big difference. I think you all know that somewhere close to 1 million Rwandans were killed in the 1994 genocide, and in subsequent travel, when President Clinton went back to Rwanda, he ended up issuing a formal apology to the people of the world, and particularly the people of Rwanda, for not having engaged at that time. And I think he actually said he felt it was the biggest mistake of his presidency, certainly in foreign policy terms. But those would be the Somali experience. I think was probably the biggest African foreign policy highlight is the wrong word, but experience of the Bush administration. When Bill Clinton became president in 1993, again, this was at a time of sort of we talked a lot about the peace dividend, and the Cold War was over. We talked a lot about in government with doing more with less and scaling back our presence around the world. Why did we need embassies? You might remember Ross Perot, who was a candidate both in 1992 and 1996, sort of famously saying, well, we have fax machines, why do we need diplomats? And I mention this because there were a number of countries and diplomatic establishments in Africa that actually closed during that period of time. One of them was our embassy in Equatorial Guinea in Malabo, where some years later I had the satisfaction of reopening our embassy and turning it over to a successor who was resident there. But we closed a number of embassies across Africa. In Cameroon, where I also served, we closed our USAID office. USAID is the Agency for International Development. It's the main vehicle of the United States government for delivering development assistance. So if you can imagine a period of time, a number of years in the 90s, where we went about closing embassies, closing consulates, and shutting down development assistance delivery on the African continent. I think it was a period where difficult messages were being received on the side of the Africans about American commitment to the continent. When George Bush became president in 2001, that was sort of the backdrop. We had, I would say, we had neglected Africa. We had sort of lost sight of what our interests were in Africa. And while George Bush, in many ways, was a controversial president, and in many parts of the world, not the most popular of our recent presidents, in Africa, he was very popular. And one of the reasons was, when he came into office, I think you might remember the phrase compassionate conservative. He sort of portrayed himself as a compassionate conservative, And probably in no other area than in Africa was it more evident what that actually meant. And primarily what that meant was engaging in health programs that would restore the health of Africans who were suffering from primarily HIV/AIDS, but also malaria and tuberculosis. It was a period of intense collaboration with groups like the Gates Foundation and the UN AIDS group, but very much led by the United States, led by the generosity of the American people under the leadership of George Bush, to put in robust programs all around the continent, in countries like in southern Africa that were suffering from HIV prevalence rates in the 40s, countries like Botswana and Swaziland. South Africa is probably in the 30s. So, I mean, countries in which they really had almost existential threats from this disease. But also malaria. Malaria is a disease that weakens the social fabric in so much of sub-Saharan Africa. And President Bush launched a program called the President's Emergency Fund that included billions of dollars for malaria and tuberculosis, as well as HIV/AIDS. So those programs, and basically what started to happen was, the United States and other donors, but primarily the United States, were actually funding antiretroviral treatment for HIV-positive mothers and fathers and children. And it became a program, it has become a program that, I mean, morally can only be sustained. How could you as a nation, once you've started HIV retroviral treatment for an entire population, decide one day, well, we're going to discontinue this? So that's something that has both continued and grown under President Obama. But I was very struck, I have to say, by how much the image of President Bush during the time that I was in Africa was shaped by these different health programs. Now that brings us sort of in a very rapid fashion to the current presidency of Barack Obama. And this has, of course, been one of the most interesting things to watch. When I was in Cameroon was about the time that Barack Obama started to become a visible political entity. He went from being a state senator in Illinois, who gave I think a very well-received speech at one of the conventions. I believe it was in 2004. 2 years later to being elected to the United States Senate from Illinois, and then 2 years later to being elected president. And of course, all of this was intensely observed and watched and applauded across the African continent. The fact that somebody whose father had come from Kenya and had been in some ways such a product of African or American policy to Africa during this period, that his father would have been one of the first Kenyans to go to the United States about the time that John F. Kennedy and the U.S. government were launching these different programs, particularly programs to bring promising African youth to the United States for university study, which I think is one of the best things we've ever done. So just watching this son of Africa rise to the heights of the American political system was something really quite inspiring to watch while I was on African soil. And then what happened when he became president? Well, I mean, it's one can speculate. As I said, he's only been to one sub-Saharan African country since he's been president. He spent a couple of days and a night in Accra. I included that as, I think, the very first, his speech that he gave before the Ghanaian Parliament as I think the first reading there, because it really does lay out a blueprint for his approach to engagement in Africa during his term, even though he has not been back. Now, Secretary Clinton has been to Africa a number of times during her time as Secretary of State. I don't know if she's going to surpass Condoleezza Rice or not as the most traveled Secretary of State in our history, but you know, she's assured of not a blue ribbon, she'll get a red one because she's been just about everywhere and has traveled through to a number of quite remote places in Africa that are quite unaccustomed to seeing people of her stature. For example, she visited Goma, which is on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's kind of the epicenter of so many negative trends that are hitting that part of Africa, including a lingering civil war. She called it the rape capital of the world, which I think statistically it is. And you know, her objective in going there was to use sort of her convening and star power, if you will, to just call the world's attention to the unacceptable situation, particularly of women in that part of Africa. But the president laid out a number of commitments. The first one was to democracy. You know, it's not for us to impose systems of government on other countries, but we certainly have observed that democracies are the most successful in providing peace and tranquility and services to the people of the countries in which they're found. So that's point number one. Number two is what he called opportunity. I think it has a lot to do with governance. It's a bit related to the first point, but one of the things that we've learned in 50 years of trying to invest in development in Africa is that there isn't much point in investing in countries where the governmental structure is riddled with corruption. So I should probably mention the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was another George Bush, or another innovation in development that came about during George Bush's presidency. And this is a little bit of a parenthesis, and I'll go back to President Obama. I mentioned the Agency for International Development, which historically had been our vehicle for delivering aid. And we do that, you know, wherever the need is, and much of it is humanitarian, and that continues. But the President Bush, in about 2003, wanted to, or committed our government to developing a new vehicle for delivering domestic development assistance, but only to those countries which met certain criteria that he felt made them more likely to be a good investment. And one of them was sort of the key one was a commitment to fighting corruption. And so that was one of them, and another one was a commitment to providing education to the children of the country in particular in question, and then the other one was a commitment to providing health. So governments that were not corrupt, or certainly less corrupt than a certain threshold, and which were committed to providing health and education to the people of those countries, would then become eligible for this Millennium Challenge account vehicle. And so the first one of those countries that received a Millennium Challenge account grant was actually Madagascar in 2005. And since then, we've had very significant called compacts signed between the Millennium Challenge Corporation and countries like Tanzania, Ghana, Mozambique. And what these countries all have in common is that they're democratic, they have elected governments, and they have these commitments to fighting corruption and helping invest in the people of those countries. So that is another legacy of the time of President Bush that has continued on under President Obama, and where I'd say it's still a work in progress in terms of trying to determine whether it's a successful model or not, and if it's not, how it can be improved. Now, when I was in Madagascar, I left there in 2010. In 2009, there was a coup, which was sort of the defining element of my 3 years in Madagascar. It happened almost midway through my tour. It happened just weeks after President Obama had been sworn in as new Secretary of State, and I think I was the first, or Madagascar with me as ambassador was the first new foreign policy crisis that came our way. It was a very small crisis in global terms, and certainly not one you could hear about because Madagascar is such a remote place. But one of the first things we had to do within a week of the coup was to terminate the Millennium Challenge account program in that country because it was so manifestly clear that a country that had just experienced a coup could not, by any stretch of the imagination, be described as meeting the criteria for the program. So now going back to President Obama and his speech, the third pillar of his engagement was health. And I think this was an important statement to make because there had been this question about, was the American commitment to the health of Africans something that was partisan and specific to President Bush and his administration, or was it something that would continue under Barack Obama in an environment of considerable fiscal pressure? But I think everything the President has said, President Obama has said, acknowledging, of course he's acknowledging the fiscal pressures that our government is under, but he's also upholding the commitment of the American people and government to continue these health programs that are so important to so many Africans. So those continue. And then the fourth area that he laid out was one of seeking peaceful resolution to crises on the continent. And it almost, of course he would say that, but in so many different circumstances. Today, if you read the newspaper, you would have seen that the youngest country in Africa, which isn't even shown on that map, South Sudan, and the rest of Sudan, which is still called the Sudan, are at this very time engaged in a very bloody military conflict over oil resources lying very close to the border between those two countries. That's one example. I can say that when I was in Cameroon, there was a very important territorial disagreement between Cameroon and Nigeria, right in the same area where that Biafran secessionist movement had held sway 40 years ago. And it was one that Cameroon had taken to both countries claiming sovereignty over a swampland that was believed to be rich in oil resources. And Cameroon, to its credit, took Nigeria to the International Court of Justice and spent many years and many millions of dollars prosecuting their case, won the case, and by the time I came to Cameroon in 2004, the main message from the Cameroonians to me was, you've got to help us to get this decision of the International Court of Justice enforced so that we can reclaim sovereignty over this land, which was not a large area, not a very populated area, maybe a wealthy area in terms of oil resources, but symbolically, again, this whole issue of the integrity, the territorial integrity of African nations based on colonial borders had to be withheld. And that was actually something I spent most of my 3 years there trying to convince my own government to do. Because you can imagine in a sort of diplomatic disagreement between Cameroon, which sort of had developed this reputation as an important but pretty dysfunctional country, and Nigeria, which was one of the two pillars of our entire Africa engagement policy, along with South Africa, that it would be very difficult for the United States to take Nigeria to task in something involving Cameroon. But we kept at it, and the Cameroonians were very good in continuing to put pressure on us, saying, well, this isn't really a matter of geopolitics, it's a matter of right and wrong, and we have taken this matter to the International Court of Justice. We've resolved this issue according to international law, and we just need you and a few other countries, going back to the colonial masters, the French, the Germans, who were the colonizers before the French and the Brits, and then the Brits, all to was something that actually happened. We had a ceremony in New York, very close to the United Nations, at which all of the nations I just mentioned were there to witness the signing. And then we actually went out to the Bokasi and presided or attended the handing over from Nigeria to Cameroon of this physical territory that had been, actually it had been the site of an actual war between the two countries in which many lives were lost. So that was one of the more gratifying things I was ever associated with in my diplomatic career. But I see it's almost 2 o'clock, so I think I'll just stop there, and having given you maybe some themes that you might want to pursue in the Q&A, or it's not just questions. I'm happy to hear any comments you have as well from your own different perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. You've given us lots to think about and talk about. One thing I'd just like to make is I know that many of you will be thinking that the Peace Corps sounds awesome. Unfortunately, you would have then Googled it and realised you need to be an American citizen to apply for the US Peace Corps. The closest thing that Australia has is the AVI, Australian Volunteers International. So if you're interested in something like that, it's not quite the Peace Corps, but it's the closest thing that most of you can probably apply for. Before I take questions, I'll ask the first question I made. So it seems like a recurring theme in your talk was the Americans' policy, the United States policy towards upholding the colonial borders of the African states. We saw this when we were talking about Nigeria in the 1960s with the Malaria Civil War. We saw this in Cameroon as well. So where does this leave South Sudan? Because it seems that America has been playing a large hand in the back, but behind the scenes towards nursing this for the newest African state. Is this a once-off? Is this seen as unusual, as an outlier, or is this a very subtle change in American policy towards Africa?
That's a really good question. Maybe can you all hear me? Very good question. I would say, the integrity of borders remains very important. It's not so much to us, it's a principle of the African Union. And one of the things that we have done, particularly since the African Union was created about 2005 or so, no, 2002, it's been around about 10 years, was to say, look, we're here to support you. You are the African institution, kind of the same way the European Union is the European institution. We've appointed an ambassador to the African Union. We're the first country to do that. And you tell us what your principles are. And kind of the same way we say you must uphold your constitution in African countries. That's always an important line we take. We took it last month when there was a coup in Mali, and we took it last month when there was a coup in Guinea-Bissau. You must respect your constitution. We'll never say what your constitution has to look like. That's for you to as Africans to decide. I would say the case of Sudan is a particularly difficult one. I mean, there was a civil war. Some would say there still is a civil war, or maybe it's not a civil war, but it's still a war that went on for 30 years between two very different peoples: the Muslim Arab people of Sudan, and the either Christian or animist Africans, black Africans of South Sudan. And what we did as the United States is we were heavily engaged in promoting a negotiated settlement between the North and between the Sudan and what became the South Sudan. And so it wasn't that they broke away and declared unilateral independence, although they may have wished to do that. It was they actually sat down at the negotiating table and negotiated their independence. The only other case that comes to mind is Eritrea, up there just above Ethiopia, which until I think it was 1993 was an integral part of Ethiopia. It had been subjugated under the empire of Ethiopia, and there was also a war there. And there was also, and continues to be, an unresolved border issue, the same way there was was previously between Nigeria and Cameroon. But in both of these cases, there was a negotiation and an international agreement that we certainly helped to midwife, but it doesn't take away from our commitment to the integrity of borders.
Questions? Just have the microphone come around so you can.
Was there a hand up?
There's a hand up the back here.
I can just yell.
Okay, you can go.
Yeah, thinking on the comment you made earlier about how the issues in Somalia led to, people wanting to step back a bit. And so given currently the fiscal issues in America and that with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the domestic citizens are sort of against intervening abroad. So given those two those two issues, do you think that the United States should take international action to stop the violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Well, I'd say that the general issue of isolationism, particularly at times of fiscal pressure, is a real one in most societies and certainly in the United States. It's not exactly what you asked, but I think it's something that, my own view is that in the end the American people will get it right, but there will always be these strong tendencies to step back and just worry about our own patch. But as far as the specific question goes, I think we made our decision some time ago to go with the UN. The UN has the largest peacekeeping force deployed in the eastern Congo of anywhere else on Earth. Has been for a long time, and I'm not going to stand here and say that it's been a great success. But I think we're going to continue to go the multilateral route with respect to that conflict and probably just about any other one on the African continent.
So with the multilateral route, do you see that as being a way for us just to contribute, when I say we, I mean America, to contribute resources but let somebody else be in charge? Or do you see that as a way for America to say, we can tell people we're involved, but really we're not going to do anything at all, and we'll just say that we're going the multilateral way and then it's up to the UN?
Well, I think, getting to the bottom of your question, I think any problem, and we can, Iraq's probably the best example. Any problem, you can give a good go to solving any problem if you're willing to put enough resources into it. The number of resources that it would take to solve the problems in the Eastern Congo, I think, go beyond what anybody is willing to put into the mix under current conditions. Just, I can't imagine what it would take to, having lived in that part of the world, knowing what it would look like, or at least imagining. Look what we're doing with Joseph Kony. That's another very interesting example that, 6 weeks ago was the most viewed tweet and YouTube on the planet. The United States put 100 troops into Uganda last October, sort of well before this came out, to deal with something that we've known about for 15 years. When I was in Cameroon, we were talking about Joseph Kony and what to do about it, and these are intractable problems. Some of these are intractable problems, but I don't think it's a question of just saying you're doing something about it. I think it's a question of, what can you do that will make a difference that's within your price range? And then, we're not the only actor either. In the case of Uganda, which I think is a good example, how much more pressure is now on the government of Uganda as opposed to on us to do things that most people would say are their responsibility rather than ours. I'd say it's a rising amount. Whether this will be sufficient to either capture or kill Joseph Kony and end what he's doing remains to be seen. Yeah.
How does China's growing interest in Africa and their involvement in African finances in particular affect American policy there?
Okay, questions about China's growing interest and involvement in Africa. That's a great question. When I first went to Africa in 1977, I saw the beginnings of Chinese engagement in Rwanda, where they were building a road. And then over my different incarnations in Africa, of course, saw the evolution of their approach, the greater sophistication. Initially they were, Chinese off to the side not speaking any language other than Chinese. If you go there today, there's many Chinese who speak whatever language is necessary to engage with the people. Mainly, I'd say we're all looking for resources. We've been looking for resources in Africa from the very beginning. We've gone in there, we've tried to get contracts, we've promoted the rule of law so that contracts would mean something. Because most of these big projects, resource extraction projects, are things that have a life of 30 to 50 years. So you're not going to go in and invest billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars up front unless you have some certainty that your contract is worth something. The Chinese, I think, are encountering the same issues. They have a somewhat of a different approach. I would say, their engagement is, as I was describing the Millennium Challenge account, for example, there are what some would call strings attached to what we do. We're not going to help you unless you continue to be committed to fighting corruption and upholding democracy, etc. The Chinese tend not to attach any strings. Sometimes that leads to a certain amount of, I won't say conflict, but discomfort. From my own experience in Madagascar, dealing with a government after a coup that had come into, had overthrown a democratically elected president, the Chinese were very much engaged in Madagascar the same way we were. They were very discomforted by the coup, very uncomfortable dealing with the coup leader in any public way, but they were unwilling to say anything publicly. Now, we were willing to actually denounce the people in charge. I can't say to great effect, other than at least the people who were the Malagasy and others, and people in other African countries who felt this was the wrong way to go, at least knew where we stood. I think, sometimes as American diplomats sometimes feel that we have a responsibility, I certainly did, to give voice to people that don't have a voice. I don't think that's a Chinese problem. They were quite happy to be quiet and not say anything and work quietly behind the scenes, not at cross purposes with us. I think one of the questions I get asked a lot is about this competition for resources. That was never a problem for us. We're used to competition. We're used to things being sold to the highest bidder. We're used to we accept the notion that a rising China is going to require a lot more of everything. Maybe we'll actually have the contract and sell it to them, or maybe they'll have the contract and get it directly. Saw that in Equatorial Guinea, where they were doing a lot of oil prospecting, and in fact, where they were buying all of the oil that we were producing in Equatorial Guinea was being produced by American companies and sold on the world market and ending up in China. So it's a lot less problematic than it seems. It's more of a nuanced difference. It has to do with with the loudness or lack of loudness of a diplomat, of their diplomacy versus ours. Yeah.
In your opinion, to what extent does America invest in tide aid as opposed to humanitarian aid? Do you think the cheap end of America's humanitarian engagement with Africa is for their own interests?
Well, tide aid per se is something that we don't do at all anymore, which is we don't ever say you can have we're going to give you this assistance, but in response to that you have to buy this product or do a specific thing. We do have criteria, and particularly with the Millennium Challenge account, we do have criteria by which we decide which countries among all the countries that would like what we have to offer, which countries will get it. And the notion is, we have a much better chance of getting a return on our investment in these democratic countries that invest in their own people and fight corruption. So that's not really the same as tide aid, but it's certainly aid with criteria that are attached, which are transparent. If you go to the Millennium Challenge account website, you'll see it all laid out there. You'll see all the methodology laid out. You'll see how we decide which countries are more deserving than others according to these criteria. And then, as we had in Madagascar, we have very detailed conversations with the government involved about whether these are, in fact, the criteria are, or the indicators, as we call them, are actually accurate indicators. Because sometimes there's methodological problems in measuring things like the number of girls that attend primary school. You know, you might say, well, this study is inaccurate. So we're always going to engage on those kinds of things. Was there another part to your question I haven't addressed?
America's national interest in Africa?
America's national interest in Africa. Well, it's a number of different things. I mean, we feel Africa is 1 billion people. We feel that a prosperous, healthy 1 billion people, or as large a proportion of those 1 billion people as possible, who are engaged in the global economy, who are not fighting wars either with themselves or with their neighbors, which often require the United States to be involved in different ways, either, quite often with humanitarian assistance. That this is all a very good investment of taxpayer money in trying to sort of prevent, encouraging the best things and mitigating the worst things. Yes, we're interested in access to resources the same way everyone is, but I wouldn't say it's driven by that. I would say, because there's a lot of countries where we have really we know where there's lots of resources, we've never done anything because the conditions weren't right. So creating, when George Bush was president, his assistant secretary was a woman named Jendai Fraser, and she summed up what the national interest in Africa was, make it safer, better, and freer. So I think that, it still stands. You've been waiting.
Sorry, totally random, different question. Operationally, have you found on a consular level, now that a lot of the US embassies have sort of become fortress-like and away from the general population, is information now more of a one-way thing out than you actually get a feel of properly what's going on within communities? You seem to withdraw quite a lot from the places where you are.
Really? Okay. Well, I guess from my own experience, that was, not the kind of ambassador I wanted to be, or the kind of embassy that I thought we should be. I thought we should be outside. We built these embassies that are a little bit fortress-like. After so many have been blown up, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. And so we've created an obstacle to engagement with, not just with Africans, but around the world. But many of us, I think, are very cognizant of that fact and spend as much time as they can in settings like this. When I was in Cameroon, Cameroon is 10 provinces, and I made it a priority when I arrived there to have been in all 10 provinces quickly. And when you go around visiting villages and sitting around with, you always meet only a certain cross sample of the people. But in Africa, it's not difficult to meet people. If you show up in a village, you'll meet everybody. They will all come out, and then you have a chance to sit down, and they all have their, the elected. Well, the chief and the elected leaders, whoever's in charge, in my experience, would always have a prepared message. And it wasn't just something they'd written the night before. They knew I was coming. They said, okay, the U.S. ambassador is coming. Let's get our act together and figure out what it is we want to say, what it is we need, what we would like to ask for. And so I always receive these communications from different villages all around the country, and responded as best I can. Often I couldn't provide what was needed, but sometimes I could, and it felt pretty good.
Has the job of being an ambassador changed significantly since?
Has the job of being an ambassador, U.S. ambassador, changed significantly since 9/11? I don't think so. Not all of my colleagues agree, but I think, frankly, diplomacy is what it's always been. It's been close personal contact with people in which they tell you what they think, and you respond. And you have an exchange, and you end up having, sometimes creating programs or projects, hopefully always creating a better understanding, even if we don't agree. Different technologies have come along. In Africa, the cell phone has just completely changed the nature of Africa. But it hasn't changed the nature of of diplomacy. Twitter hadn't come along. Not that many people had access to the internet, so I can't say that that had really changed things, except that, I mean, even if you had a low penetration rate, if there was information that, well, WikiLeaks is a good example. I mean, you know, after WikiLeaks exploded, there was all this information that was previously unavailable to people, and believe me, anybody who wanted it found it, including in Africa, and despite the fact that there was a low level of internet, you know, penetration. But I think the job is still what it's always been, and I don't see how that's going to change. It's that plus other things. You need to be savvy about all these modern technologies, but there's no substitute for that close personal engagement that we do as diplomats.
Hands.
In one of our readings, we had it mentioned aid in kind from the US. I was just wondering what kind of proportion that is, and I guess how is that driven domestically, I suppose?
Yeah. Very good question. It's well, you know, we do have in our laws and regulations notions like Buy America, and we also have laws and regulations that require us to ship on American ships. You know, when I fly, if there's no option, I fly on an American airplane or American carrier, or a carrier that has a co-chair relationship with an American carrier. So there are all these preferences that are built into our laws that you know, they're all not they're all common around the world for countries that do what we do to, you know, have those kind of limitations. Where I saw it play out was in food aid. I mean, the notion, you know, some of it's just not that efficient and maybe even that logical. But you know, when we were selling wheat, concessional wheat under PL 480 to Madagascar. So they would buy the wheat from us at a under market price, then sell it domestically to, you know, bakeries and flour mills and other people, and that would be their source of wheat. Now, why would you take wheat grown in Kansas or Montana, put it on a ship and take it all the way to Madagascar when you could buy wheat in South Africa and ship it across the Mozambique Channel at much less cost? Well, obviously we're helping American farmers, and you know, it's a global market. So, but I would say that was a small proportion of what we're doing. And we give away $30 billion a year in assistance. I would say probably, you know, 10% of that is involved in programs like that do have a domestic constituency.
Hi. How significant a role does special forces play in defending America's strategic interest in Africa? And what do you think the future role of special forces might be in Africa?
Special forces. I think I mean, they have some unique capabilities. I mean, we all saw the way Osama bin Laden was taken out, and if we were to have to do that anywhere in the world, we would go to special forces. I mean, they have some unique capabilities, but I don't see very many circumstances in Africa where that kind of thing would be necessary or has been necessary. We have troops in Djibouti. We have a base there called Camp Lemonnier, which has been mainly engaged in fighting, in helping out with Al-Qaeda-related security problems in the Horn of Africa, and then in the fight against piracy in the Indian Ocean. But I don't think there's any special forces base there. So I'm just trying to think. I mean, are the people who are there advising? I'm not sure who's advising the Ugandan government. I know it's 100 troops. I don't know what units they're from. There may be some special forces involved there. Again, in an advisory role, telling them how the trade craft would work and how they might find and take down Mr. Coney. And then, I mean, the other way is in the protection of diplomats. I mean, after the coup in Madagascar, there was a concern. I mean, Madagascar is a big island, you know, and the question that Washington was asking me was, well, if things really go south, how are you going to get off the island? How are you and your people going to get off the island? And, you know,